This channel is supported by TrueFire. TrueFire is an online library of lessons from some of my favourite players. There's thousands of lessons on there. You can use the promo code JNC40 to get 40% off of any of their courses. Okay, I was too bright. Participating in the New Year's quiz with Tom Quayle, Jack Gardner, James Davies, Jens Larsen, Joseph, Andy Dar, Beebs, and Rhett Scholl, Jake Wilson. And we got talking a little bit. I think Tom had kind of, and obviously David Beebe, incredibly interested in this, kind of getting onto this notion about how all of us in this chat have been using plugins basically wrong, except for Jack Gardner, although I think even he ended up, so he uses the Quad Cortex as his interface, but when he looked at what he was doing on his input 2, which is sometimes where he plugs in, he's got that plus 6 dB. Right, so I've done another video on this. Basically all of this is based on the work of pretty much one guy, Ed, if you're watching, but I'll link that guy below because I think it's kind of important, and we'll call this thing the Sokolowski standard. I can't say your name properly, sorry. But anyway, Ed is the guy, and I think he's basically responsible for badgering a lot of these companies and trying to get this word out there, and I think hopefully for me it's made quite a big difference in understanding, even though I don't really understand properly, but I can see that there is a problem at least. Right, so what this is not a problem of, it's not a problem of impedance, it's not a problem of when you plug in different guitars, things sounding different. It's not the same as other problems that we have in the modelling or amp world. Right, what this problem is a lack of a bass line, and I'll explain why. There's two bass lines that are missing. So, first of all of these companies that make these plugins, they calibrate however they're making their plugins. So in some circumstances, like Neural DSP, say, in the calibration and kind of, what would the word be? Like the checking process of the final stages of the plugin, or even the start stages, you have to calibrate whatever you're using to interface with the plugin. And there is like a baseline that they set internally that they make their plugins to. So for Neural DSP, I think it's 12 minus, or 12.2 is the number. I think line 6 use a different number, and I think that is the case basically for most plugin manufacturers. They actually use a different number. So this is the level at which they are firing a signal into the plugin. Necessarily the whole kind of modeling industry for a while, and plugins as well, has been about accuracy, right? So if we care about accuracy, that is why some of this stuff might matter, as well as people like me and people that are making presets for these plugins, and even the manufacturers themselves giving us bad advice on this stuff. What the bad advice is, by the way, is to set your interface to as loud as possible, but before clipping. That's basically the advice that Neural DSP, Line 6, and a bunch of other people have given. It's not good advice because basically I ended up with a plus 17 dB boost happening, and you imagine therefore that none of the modeling is necessarily going to be particularly accurate anymore. It's basically going to be like you were running a pretty aggressive boost in front of everything, and that will then squish everything up. It might be something that you want to do, but this is about like getting a satisfactory baseline which is actually closer to what the manufacturers would do. So, as I say, all your companies have like a slightly different number. Ed has actually done the research. He's contacted all these companies and gone through a painstaking process of trying to get these answers from these folks. For whatever reason, some companies have been a little bit more difficult to deal with, as I understand it. But I think really important work. So that's baseline one. Like, what is the company actually using as their number that they are creating these plugins with? For some of them, I think Amplitude is one, they actually have different numbers for different amp models, which then throws this way off. But the big players in the game, like Line 6 and Neural DSP, and I think STL and Mercurial, I think they, at least for each of their own amp models, use the same baseline. Right, so that's baseline one. So that is effectively like, you know, whoever makes the model, where do they set this calibration point? What is that number? So that whatever guitar you were to plug into their thing, it would respond how that guitar would plug if you plugged it into the real thing that they're modeling, if you care about accuracy. Right. Or, you know, how it was supposed to be done. Then the second thing is that all interfaces pretty much are a little bit different. And they basically chuck out, different levels of gain, which increasingly creates an additional problem. Now, this is actually, I think, slightly less of an issue than the one before. So the main thing, if you take anything away from this video, is don't do what I've been doing for years now, and that I've been putting out there as kind of the advice that the companies give you to do, of adding gain on the gain pot. Basically, all of the interfaces, pretty much, if you have in the high Z input, turn them down to 0, that's going to be closer to being accurate than if you add gain on that gain pot, essentially, because the 0 is in some cases still going to be louder than you would have needed, but at least if you set it to 0, you're probably going to be within the ballpark, like a couple of dB. But that's the other problem. So Ed has also gone to the painstaking process of going through the manuals and specifications for some of the more popular models. I think Universal Audio and Focusrite, you could just set to 0 and be pretty happy. Most of the interfaces, if you basically set them to 0-ish, you'll be within the ballpark. And if you're plugging in a modeler, some of those are a little bit different as well. But again, this seems to be where there's a little bit less variation, sort of. The ones with the biggest difference seem to be like a Presonus Studio 24C, or a Motu M4, or an SSL 2+, the Focusrite stuff, the Line 6 Helix, the Universal Audio stuff, the Universal Audio Apollo Twin, the Audient iDay 4. Those tend to be around 12 to 14. Okay, so that's kind of the two things. He actually has a Google Doc. I'm going to ask him, you know, if folks can, maybe he can comment it and put it in the comments, so that basically there's a number that you can pick out of his spreadsheet which will put you in that ballpark of accuracy. For me personally, I think at least moving my audio interface way down to 0 instead of where I had it, which would have been about 33% of the way up the pot, is at least bringing me within some realm of, you know, closeness to what the actual folks making these plugins would have been doing. So that's what I'm doing. and I think Tom Quayle as well said similarly, this actually made a huge difference to him in terms of how he felt like the plugin was reacting to his playing. And yeah, so that's what I'm going to be doing. Just consider it, and maybe you don't want to be running a huge boost into your plugins without realizing that's what you're doing by following the advice of other, well, all the manufacturers. So this is kind of new kind of practice from Ed, and I think, I personally think incredible work, really important, and you know, the sort of thing that hopefully I can help to get his message out there a bit. But we really should be talking about the Sokolowski standard. I'm not going to be able to say that properly, am I? The Edward standard, where essentially the companies kind of standardize, or if they're not going to, the interface companies, there's one number there where they should hopefully consider standardizing what that input level would be. And then the plugin side of things, similarly, you'd hope that they'd kind of standardize and say, right, well, most of us are going to be using this number, or at least give you that number without Ed having to chase it in the background for weeks and weeks and months and maybe even years. So that's the problem with plugins. There's two of them. There's no baseline on these two sections, and that's what Ed is trying to figure out. I hope that's vaguely interesting. There's a number basically per plugin and per interface that you need to be aiming for, but at least try taking your interface gain down to 0, and you'll be closer than if you do what we're told to do in general. Thanks for stopping by, and I'll catch you in another video soon. Cheers.